Hi there. In this edition of Break It Up, we focus on the Pahalgam terror attack and how there's an attempt by a section of the Western media to systematically downplay the ideological and religious motives behind the attack. Instead of labeling the perpetrators as terrorists, many reports refer to them as militants or gunmen and describe this incident as a shooting rather than a terror attack. For instance, the New York Times describes the perpetrators as militants and gunmen and refers to the brutal massacre of 28 tourists, mostly Hindus, as a shooting instead of the heinous terror attack that it was. The US government panel, in fact, it's the House Foreign Affairs Committee majority of the US, has publicly rebuked the New York Times. In fact, this particular committee has shared an edited version of the NYT headline on social media, replacing militants with terrorists in bold red, and declared that this attack was unequivocally a terrorist act, criticizing the newspaper for being removed from reality when reporting on terrorism, whether in India or elsewhere. But it's not only limited to the New York Times. Major Western media outlets, including the BBC, CNN, Reuters, and even The Guardian, are facing intense criticism for their coverage of the recent Pahalgam terror attack in Jammu and Kashmir, as they stand accused of obscuring the true nature of such attacks and even failing to acknowledge what it actually was: Pak terrorists engaging in Hindu carnage. And for more on this, let's quickly go across to Suhag Shukla, who's a executive director of the Hindu American Foundation. Thanks so much, Suhag, for joining us and speaking to us here at Times Now. Now, you've called out several of these major Western media outlets for whitewashing the Pahalgam terror attack. And what, in your view, drives this kind of selective sanitization of Islamist terror when the victims particularly are Hindus and were evidently profiled on religious grounds?
Well, thanks for having me. I think it starts with the editorial department of these media houses. There, if you look just broadly, like step back a little bit and look at the way that India broadly is covered, you see no hesitancy in describing democratically elected parties or leaders as militants, as extremists, as fascists. But when it comes to actual terrorists, they seem to be allergic to the word.
Okay, but is this ideological bias? Is it institutional apathy? Or is it something else that drives this, apart from what the editorial departments of all these organizations are engaged in?
Look, I'm not in those rooms to know, but we do know that the media has a responsibility, and especially in an age of, social media propaganda as well as deep fakes, that responsibility is even more important. When the media is not reporting accurately, or when they're allowing biased language to creep into how they're covering stories in real time, or whether they're allowing editorializing, it distorts the public understanding and perceptions. This has a direct impact on how policy is made. Now, in the United States, we've seen with what happened in Israel that the way in which, Hamas's attack in Israel, how that was initially covered, and how media coverage has a direct impact on perceptions about what's happening. It's important that we call a spade a spade.
Absolutely. And the very fact that the House Foreign Affairs Committee majority of the US corrected the New York Times headline, saying that, hey, New York Times, we fixed it for you. This was a terrorist attack, plain and simple. Do you believe that such a direct and unequivocal correction of the New York Times by the House Foreign Affairs Committee, calling out the headline and labeling the incident as a clear terrorist attack, would have been possible under the previous Biden administration's influence, given its track record on narratives around terrorism in India and even Israel?
Well, that tweet did come from the GOP handles, so we know that it came from the Republican Party. I don't have a crystal ball to know what the Democratic Party would have said, but the fact is that when you refer to terrorists as just rebels in some cases, it minimizes and provides potentially cover to these groups, making it easier for them to operate as well as to recruit. Downplaying also is going to have an adverse impact on counter extremism efforts. If we don't know the enemy that we are trying to counter, if they're just whitewashed as rebels, it really is going to hamstring not just current efforts, but future efforts and the support for them. The media really shouldn't be involved in contributing to the idea that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter.
Right. And also, given the scale and brutality of the Pahalgam attack, how damaging is this kind of narrative manipulation, not just to truth telling, but to the global understanding of terror?
No, it's very detrimental. We're already seeing it on college campuses, right? We've seen references to India being a settler colonial state, and people might just laugh things off. Well, these are young people. What's the big deal? But those young people, when we start misinforming them, when their worldviews are being shaped by misinformation or whitewashed information, those are the future journalists. Those are the future policymakers. It is incredibly important for us to have accurate information, calling a spade if it's a terrorist attack, and it was because they were specifically targeting civilians, specifically identifying them by religion for an ideological and religious war.
Now, you've also come on to say that Western media outlets, whether it's the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, BBC, Reuters, so on and so forth, have always downplayed terrorism and sanitized it. They've hid the victims as well as religious identities and even put the words terror attack in sneer quotes. They are essentially accusing them of deliberate erasure. How do you respond to critics who call this a bit of an overstatement?
It's, we can talk about the sneer quotes, but they're not isolated. And that's the point here. When they refer to the abrogation of Article 370, the implication in the way that it's presented is that it was some heavy-handed movement, not something that was proceeded through parliamentary procedure. Certainly, there hasn't been any mention of the Supreme Court ruling that it was a constitutional move. There's no mention of even going back as far as 1947 and the accession by Hari Singh Maharaj to India, or that wars have been started by Pakistan. There's a false equivalency that's created in a lot of these that, oh, this is a dispute between Pakistan and India, as if both countries have been equally culpable in terrorism and in increasing tensions. We know that there have been 3 wars, all of them instigated by Pakistan. These are facts that would give broader understanding, historical context. And so if they had used terror attack in quotes, say just because they want to maybe wait to see that it's been confirmed, the rest of the stories really lend to why I perceive those as sneer quotes.
And you've also said that you couldn't sleep and kept searching for stories from all of these media outlets, hoping for some honest, accurate reportage on the horrific anti-Hindu terror attack in Pahalgam, only to be met with disappointment. Do you believe that there's a pattern of editorial spin, particularly when there are attacks like Pahalgam, part of a deeper issue in how global media frames Hindu victims as well as Islamist terror?
100%. I mean, if we go back to 2019 during the news stories around the abrogation of Article 370 and 35A, we did an actually deep analysis. I invite your viewers to visit our website, hinduamerican.org, to see our analysis on the coverage then. Very few, if none, mentioned the ethnic cleansing of 350,000 Kashmiri Pandits from the valley in the late 1980s and 1990s. They focused on the BJP being a Hindu party, and they focused on the region being Muslim majority. How did these things come into play? How does a region that has been for thousands of years a place of traditional Hindu and Buddhist spiritual learning, of sacred sites, suddenly change demographics? It doesn't happen overnight. It's happened over time. That historical context is critical in understanding what's at play today. Yet you would not find it in mainstream coverage, not in 2019 and not in this past week.
Right. I'm asking this because this isn't the first time that we're seeing such an incident happen. We've seen how, there has been bias, particularly towards India. For instance, BBC and CNN had portrayed Atiq Ahmed, who we know as a very well-known gangster, being portrayed instead as a lawmaker.
Yeah, it happens at every level, whether it's the coverage of what's happening at the Indian governance level, whether it's about the ground realities in Kashmir and the real threat of ongoing terror, whether it is the progress that's happening. I mean, in one article, the attack was somehow linked to development that's occurring in Kashmir with the train lines that are set to be built that would provide greater connectivity for people to visit Kashmir and for the people of Kashmir to get from one place to another. This somehow is blamed for the terror attacks. Tourism, something that any area benefits from, is somehow painted as the root cause, and somehow that area then deserves tourists to be shot dead.
Absolutely. And, along with this bias that is there, anti-India, anti-Hindu, whatever one chooses to call it, there's also the corollary of how media organizations often end up amplifying Pakistani narratives, despite the fact that all of this terror is being perpetrated by the deep state there in Pakistan.
Well, there's been, I know, footage from the head of the military, Asim Munir, from the parliament, where he spoke very disparagingly about India as well as Hindus, and again reiterated their single focus on Kashmir as opposed to helping the people of Pakistan with development. We also saw, I think just this morning, my desk has been flooded with an interview saying where a Pakistani official is admitting to funding terrorism, and at the behest of the United States. I've not fact-checked that, but these stories are slowly trickling out, but they're not necessarily being covered by the New York Times. They're not being covered by Washington Post. You have to rely on regional media, on Indian media, or even some international outlets. But the New York Times or Washington Post or even BBC, I don't think there's going to be much hope in finding those stories there.
Right. And also, your organization has been talking extensively about the growing normalization of anti-Hindu rhetoric in the United States. Can you tell us something about that?
Well, we've been seeing spikes on social media, whether it's related to, geopolitical realities in India or whether it's anti-immigrant sentiment here. We're actually seeing it from both sides of the political spectrum, whether it's, far left radical South Asian activists, or whether it's from nativists and Christian nationalists, really disparaging Hindus and making our kind of safety and well-being in this country as a micro-minority in a tenuous situation.
All right. Suhag Shukla, I'd like to thank you so much for taking the time out and speaking to us here.
Thank you.